coming when it's cold. I mean, that's dedication, right?
Yeah.
So let's take a moment as we get started this morning.
Well, we came Thursday morning, we only come Thursday morning, 4 o'clock in the morning, nobody was here.
No.
No, that was actually Monday morning.
Monday morning, yeah.
At 4 o'clock in the morning. And truth in advertising, I didn't make it up. I had a little bit of an issue. But I did get up a little bit later, and so did Mickey, and we did the prayer anyway.
You get up
Yeah,
at
it is.
4.
Yeah.
Wow.
So, all right, well, listen, let's take a moment before we get started, or even several moments, and we'll reflect upon the idea, the concept that there is an infiniteness that we refer to by many names. We'll be talking about it this morning, actually. But ultimately, we call it God or Spirit or First Cause. And it's the power and the presence in the universe from which all things come. Is the creative force. It is the law. It is all the good that we experience in our life and everything else. It not only expresses as life itself, it expresses as us. It surrounds us. It provides for us. It is ever present. And it is a source of our good, and it's a source that we can go to. So when we take time like we do this morning, we open up our hearts and our minds, we know that we can make that connection within ourselves, and we do. There's a power and a presence for good in the universe that's available to each and every one of us. And today as we come together here, and we know as we come together here that our greatness is made manifest in this place, that we experience the goodness of God that's in this place, and we take this out into our life through the week so that our week is even more empowered and more provided for with harmony, peace, goodness, health, and abundance. And we do this in honest consciousness, in recognition of truth, and in love and thanksgiving. And we release this to God, knowing that we are forever guided and guarded in our life. And so it is. Okay, so today we're going to talk about the thing itself. But I want to go through a couple things as we get started. First, if you have a copy of the textbook and you have the day-to-day throughout the year study, the very first study for the year is on page 419, and it's called New Cloth and Old Garments. And Holmes says, in the saying that no man puts a piece of new cloth on an old garment or new wine into old bottles, Jesus was teaching a lesson in religious development. We are continuously living in new life, and when the old and new do not fit nicely together, the old, being no longer able to contain the new, should be discarded. Continuously, we must expect new revelations of old truths. We should never lose sight of the fact that the soul is on a pathway of an endless and ever-expanding experience, and that only by expansion can it evolve. This does not mean that we should cast away any good from the old, but we should convert it into a greater good, accepting the lessons and experiences of the past and taking the best from everything. We should press solidly or boldly forward, looking ever for the truth and ever ascending higher and higher into the heavens of reality. There is no limit to the possibility inherent in all men. Let the timid soul put its complete trust in good and press bravely on. And so as we start the new year and we start in the textbook, and Holmes talks about the thing itself. You know, as I closed last week, I said that I would share with you what I really think is the most exciting thing about this. In brief, it is, well, let me set the stage before we get started. Going back to the turn of the 19th to the first part of the 20th century, it was at the end of what they called the Third Great Awakening within the country. The first one took place prior to the Revolutionary War. The second one followed came about and ended prior to the Civil War. And then the third one came about post-Civil War and into the earliest part of the 20th century. And those great awakenings, what they were talking about is spiritual awakenings within the country. At that time, you had a lot of evangelism going on and people going around and all sorts of good stuff, right? But at that same time, there was this thing called New Thought that got its birth in about 1850, 1860, and it began to grow. Mary Baker Eddy took it to a certain extent with the formation of Christian Science, but there were other people that looked at what she had taught and said, well, maybe there's something more. Maybe God is not quite so limited. And then New Thought got its foundation, began to grow. There was a lot of early writers, and all this is going on. And this whole energy of spiritual awareness and awakening was taking place. So in about 1910, a fellow by the name of, I don't remember his first name, his last name was Stewart. And he was one of the founders of Union Oil in Los Angeles, him and his brother. And they were very devout Christians, and they believed that what was going on in Christianity at that time was just kind of getting out of hand. So they had a little bit of money as a result of being in oil. They hired a couple of three editors, and there was about 60 different authors, and they generated a 17-volume set of books called The Fundamentals, from which fundamentalist Christianity gets its name. That's where it comes from. And it was a revision, well, it was a relook at Christianity and taking it back to seeing the Bible as the inerrant word of God, and it was a very conservative approach to religion. About that time, or a little bit later, there was a Baptist minister in New York, and his name was Harry Emerson Fosdick. And Harry Fosdick was he was more liberal. He looked at the Bible from a historical perspective. He taught it as a book that was written in a certain time and a certain place, and we had to understand the time and place to understand the context of what was in it. And he gave a talk on Sunday, and on a Sunday in May of like 1920, 1922, somewhere thereabouts. And it was called, Should We Let the Fundamentalists Win? And it stirred up a whole bunch of stuff in the country. And he was called before the powers that be in his spiritual organization, and he was put on trial. He was eventually let off, but only because he offered to step down from the pulpit of the church where he was at. But a fellow by the name of John D. Rockefeller was so impressed by this that he actually built a whole church in New York for Harry Fosdick. And it's called the Riverside Church. And in that church, it still exists today. People that have spoken there have been the Dalai Lama, Martin Luther King, a whole bunch of other people. And Harry Fosdick, he had this pulpit that he taught from. Now, his teaching was still within the basic precepts of Christianity, but it was much more liberal, if you will. Okay. So in this whole thing going on, and there's one other thing I want to touch on real quick. There was a fellow by the name of Father Coughlin. Father Coughlin. In the 1930s, he had a radio program. In the 1930s, his radio program had an audience of something like 30 million. We're talking, he reached a lot of people. And he taught his form of Christianity, but he kind of evolved he got into some very not so positive things. He was a supporter of the fascists in Europe, and he was rather an anti-Semite at the time. He subsequently got taken off the air. But all this spiritual stuff was going on. And in that context, Ernest Holmes, he was writing this book. He wants to teach people about this New Thought philosophy. He understands the power of mind, and he understands also that the beliefs that we hold, the fixed beliefs that we hold, can limit our ability to understand, to grow, and to expand our consciousness. So instead of coming straight on at the concept of God, which Christianity had pretty much solidified, and at that time, if you lived in this country and someone said God, everybody pretty much had the same idea and understanding what they were talking about. He said, wait a second, let's do this a little bit different. Instead of going straight at the word God, let's call it the thing itself. And the beauty and the genius in calling it the thing itself is, even though he still continued to use the word God in his teachings, and he used spirit, the first cause, and many other things, but to identify it as the thing itself in the beginning allowed people to begin to learn and to embody what he was teaching. And the mind itself, their mind, the fixed beliefs they had about God, were not so much of an impediment to what he was learning, right? Or what he was teaching. So that kind of laid the groundwork for it. And yeah, I just realized I got so excited about taking off the shirt, I forgot the opening song. Oh, well, there you go. Let's do this, right? We're gonna wake, we're gonna wake, our minds, we're gonna wake, we're gonna wake, our minds, we're gonna wake, we're gonna wake, our minds, because today is the day, and now is the time. There is, there is a light, and it shines in me. There is a light, and it shines in me. There is a light, and it shines in me. And we're gonna turn it up for the whole world to see. There you go. Yeah. All right. Ever right on and rigid in our day schedule, right? Okay. So the thing itself, and I like the way Holmes did this. And he says here, let me use the books. I thought I could do that.
Are you going to pass those out?
No, that's just one copy for me.
Oh.
Thank you very much. No.
Oh, boo.
Yeah. So he says,
Just tell me the page and I can get to it.
we look forward to the day, okay? We look forward to the day when we can all understand that there are things that we don't see that have power and presence in our life. You know, he refers to science. He says we have basically theories in science that scientists have to accept. They have no vision of it. They have nothing concrete, but without it, what they're trying to do isn't going to move forward. So they have to accept these unseen things. And he likens this to what we're talking about when we talk about spirit. And when we talk about spirit, when we talk about God, I want to pause for a minute and reflect on two things. Energy is the ability to do work, as physicists tell us, right? But there's another kind of energy, and that's life force energy. And life energy doesn't necessarily do work in the traditional understanding, and yet it still recognizes a form of energy. And in that same vein, when we talk about thought and thought energy, that's not the same kind of energies like electrical energy or something like that. Thought energy is a spiritual energy. And so we're talking about two different universes, if you will. The physical universe and the spiritual universe, okay? So when we talk about thought and the power of thought, although the power of thought through the law has an effect in the physical universe, it's not the same as electrical energy where we can plug it into something and flip on the switch and watch the light go on, right? So he says, to suppose the creative intelligence of the universe would create a man in bondage and leave him bound would be to dishonor the creative power. And what he's talking about is the idea that if we, as beings with consciousness, were not stressed and challenged by our life experience, if we just came in and we were automatically programmed to do whatever, then we wouldn't be independent. Okay, it had to be spontaneous. We have to have the ability to stub our toes. We have to have the ability to succeed. You know, we have to fail in order to learn how to succeed. And that's part of the process. The process started with evolution. We got to the point of our I am moment. At that point, then we became aware. We had a volition. And humanity became responsible for our evolution from that point forward. And we've evolved. We've evolved in many ways. And in about a month, we're going to talk about something called race consciousness and how it affects what we experience today in things that are not necessarily real positive, and yet it's a very real force. So he says, okay, we come into this world and we have the ability to fail, because we need the ability to fail in order to learn the truth of who we are. He says, we see the abundance in the universe. He talks about the grains of sand on the beach, talks about all these different things. Think about how many planets there are, how many galaxies there are. I mean, there's billions and billions, and there may be even more in the offing that we're not even aware of. What does it take to create this? Something that's extremely limited or something that's unlimited?
Unlimited.
It's something that's unlimited, right? So we're looking at, and what he's trying to define is the idea of an limitedness, that is ever present. Ever present. No place, no space where God is not. Again, we're talking about this spirituality, this spiritual energy. You know, Jesus told the woman at the well that God is spirit and we must worship God in spirit. And that's one of the early teachings that we get, that we have to understand that God's not a guy. God didn't walk through some garden somewhere and leave footprints and kick people out and this, that, and the other. Going back to the day when Holmes was writing this, and all those things that I talked about in the beginning were going on, he's challenging the world at that point in time. He's saying, you know what? We just don't accept it as that way. And he's talking about it in what we call a metaphysical sort of way. And what he tells people is that, because metaphysical is one of those big words, and people were kind of a little skeptical, something more sophisticated than what they can wrap their minds around. He said, wait a second, metaphysics is very simple. We're going to talk about that today in part of this understanding. Metaphysics is very simple. Understanding metaphysics is very simple. And he wanted people to understand that because he wanted them to know that there's nobody that can be held back from this. There's no one that shouldn't feel that they have what it takes to understand this. That anybody that takes the time to put this into practice, what he's teaching, can get the same results from anybody else that puts it into practice. It's a powerful concept and a powerful thought. And it's a thought that he talks about. When he talks about the thing itself, he talks about using it. Another massive new concept in the world at that time. People didn't get the idea of using God. What does that mean, using God? Well, it's much easier to understand using the thing, using first cause, using principle. And as he's beginning to teach people this concept, this is what he's talking about. We'll take a music break, Steve. Mazda. It's good enough for me. That old time religion, old time religion, it's good enough for me. Now, going back again to this time when Dr. Holmes wrote this book, think about what was going on in the world. We just come through the greatest war of all times, and yet the world is in a great deal of upheaval, getting ready to go into another world war. So, you know, it's not like things were all cool, calm, and collected at that time. And so he wrote, and it's a little bit later in chapter 1, but I'm gonna start with it here. He says, we find ourselves torn by confusion, by conflict, by affirmation and denial, by emotions congested by fear, congealed by pride. We are afraid of the universe in which we live, suspicious of people around us, and certain of the salvation of our own souls. And all these things negatively react and cause physical disorders. He could have written it today. Kind of sounds like what's going on. We're dealing with a lot of that in the world today, and that's why week after week, as I talk about creating this inner peace, this and making that inner connection with Source, with God, with the thing itself. Not only does it change you, but it changes the world around you.
Yes.
You know, someone once talked about having a glass of water full of muddy water,
Yes.
you know, and drop by drop of a single drop of clear water in there. Any given drop's not going to make a great deal of difference. But as you continue to drop those drops in that glass of water, eventually
Right.
that water that we can't see begins to clear. And then it becomes crystal clear. It's the same way in our personal life, and it's the same way in the world. So Holmes says here, the study of the science of mind is a study of first cause, spirit, mind, or that invisible essence of ultimate stuff and intelligence from which everything comes. The power behind creation, the thing itself. It's almost like a build-up or an introduction to the word, the thing itself. You know, it's the power behind everything, the thing itself. And he's talking, of course, about God and God in our life. And he says, we accept this thing and believe in it. What we desire is to know more about it and how to use it. Concept in that time, you know, how to use this thing called God. You know, if we're going to use God, then we have to understand a couple things about this thing that we're using. And that is, does it hold a grudge? Is it judgmental? I mean, these are things that are part of the history of this word, right? But he says, no, he says, God is impersonal. God doesn't care about you personally. Now, that sounds kind of cold on one hand, but the idea is that no matter who you are, no matter what level of understanding you are, God is available as equally to you as anybody else. There's no place where you can go. There's no place where you can be where all of God is not available to you. But God's available to you at the level that you understand, the level that you believe, the level of the faith that you have. Okay? And so as we move forward, and he says, the universe never plays favorites, and that's what we're talking about. He says, the profound thought of all the ages has stood in awe of life itself, realizing that there is a power and potentiality, the highest possibility of which the human intellect cannot fathom. The creative force of the universe that we call God is a being of consciousness. And in order to have consciousness, it has to have something to be conscious of. And thus creation came about. But through the evolutionary process of creation, the ultimate goal of that was to produce a being that had a level of volition and consciousness. In other words, the ability to make choices. And I talked a little bit about that. Our choice is what can take us down the fairy path to more abundance, good, happiness, peace, and harmony, or it can take us out into limitation, disease, and unhappiness, and all the sort of stuff that we give a label of evil to. And evil exists in this world as an experience, but God does not have evil within it. And our understanding of this, the way we teach this, is that people can make ignorant mistakes. People can seek to deal with the world from a position of isolation in their mind, in their consciousness from the divine principle. And as they do so, they see, because they're tied to their five senses, they see limitation in the world, and they see that if they're going to have theirs, someone else has got to lose. So they take from others to get theirs. Subsequently, things don't go so well for them on an ultimate level. And this is part of the teaching. When we want to create a better good, a greater good in our life experience, we talk about using prayer and treatment. When we do that, in our prayer, in our treatment, it is to treat for ourselves, but also for those around us, to bring everybody up with us.
That's right.
Okay? In energy, in love. Okay? And when we understand this, see, one of the things that is in today's world, a lot of what religious science and New Thought teaches is it's out there in the communities. I mean, the power of positive thinking and, all this sort of stuff, Think and Grow Rich, and it's just everybody's tied into it. They've heard about it at some level, but not necessarily in conjunction with a spiritual principle. And the spiritual principle is that God works for you as you work in harmony with God. And so that takes us over here where he talks about, let's see here. Did I miss it already? Okay, yeah, it's right here. He talks about love and law. Okay, and I want to read something to you here, because this simple little sentence has a lot of deepness in it. He says, as the love of God is perfect, so the law of God is also perfect. We must understand both. When we say that the law of God is perfect, what we mean is that as we avail ourselves of the love of God, which is the creative force, the provider, if you will, of God, right? The spiritual aspect of God that gives the gift, that brings the good into our life. The law is also perfect, and that means that if we're not in alignment with the law, with that perfection, to the degree that we're not in alignment with that law, that we're not in alignment with that perfection, to that degree, it's also not done unto us. And today, in today's world, in New Thought, particularly in religious science, we get people that, they like the idea. It feels good. We got a feel good kind of spirituality. Everybody goes, yeah, and God's everywhere present. This feel good and all this stuff. But are they creating the life for themselves that they want to live? And not so much. And the reason why is they haven't figured out the reason why. But it's because, so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so. I just can't tolerate those people or that group of people. Or, my brother, I don't want to have anything to do with my brother. Now, it's one thing, and we've talked about this, it's one thing to put up healthy boundaries. But the two great commandments are that we love God with all that we are, and we love our neighbors as ourselves.
Yes.
Okay, and there's no exception in that.
Right.
So you cannot hold something against somebody and try to put the law into practice through treatment in your life and expect to experience more and greater good, right?
Right.
Come on in.
Hey.
How you doing?
What do you think of it?
We'll have a song. It's a good time for rain. Thank you. So the thing is, no pun intended, but the thing is that, you know, when Holmes was talking about this idea, this concept of the thing itself, and we're talking about God and putting God into practice in our life, and as I've said, there are people today that they want to experience what New Thought talks about. They want to experience what, you know, we talk about the law of attraction. They want to experience that, but they fail to align themselves with principle. They fail to bring themselves into an understanding of where they have to be. And that brings me to where I want to go next with this. And Holmes says, some people are healed through prayer, while others are not. The answer is not that God has responded to some and not to others, but that some have responded to God more than others. Mm-hmm. And that's the teaching, okay? When we respond to the divine principle, when we align ourselves within harmony of what God teaches, we're talking about love, peace, harmony. You know, the law is perfect. In perfection, there is no place for discord. And to the degree that we bring discord into that, to that degree, again, we fail to apply ourselves to the principle, and the principle fails to apply itself back to us. It's kind of a reciprocal sort of thing. I think, let me check here real quick.
God meets us where we are.
That's it. I want to go here in the textbook, if you happen to have a copy, to page 285. It's one of my more favorite spots in the textbook. And Holmes says here, he says, faith in God is such a complete conviction that the Spirit will make the gift, that there is no longer any subjective contradiction when faith in God is, okay? He says, faith can exist only in such a degree as the law of the universe, faith can exist only in such a degree as the conviction is in line with reality. In line with reality. And so he goes on to say, we cannot believe any law of the universe will ever change its own nature because we desire to do so. We can't hold on to our stuff. We got to give it up. We got to let it go. And he says, as we come into the spiritual realm, which is a perfectly natural and normal realm, we have to come into it in its own nature. It is a unity. There must be nothing vicious in it. Remember what Jesus said. Therefore, when thou bring thy gift to the altar and rememberest that thy brother has aught against thee, Go thy way first and be reconciled with thy brother, and then come and offer thy gift. Why? Because we cannot enter into peace when we are in a state of confusion. And when we talk about state of confusion, that can be anger, it can be worry, it can be discord of any particular nature. When we are in that state of confusion, we are not in a state of harmony. That's what he's talking about. He says, it cannot be done. We cannot manifest love when we have a mental equivalent of hate in our hearts and minds. And that's what we're talking about. When he says God is love and God is law, the love is the givingness of God, the creativeness of God. The law is the way through which God gives it in all of our lives. And if we can't align ourselves with God in principle, the law works for us only at the level and the degree in which we have limited ourselves. And that's important to understand. As you go forth this week, you go into your day-to-day life experience. If you find where you kind of get caught a little uncomfortable, things aren't quite working right, just pause for a minute. Maybe you need to take a deep breath. Bring yourself into alignment. You know, okay, I can realize that maybe there's some things I got to work on. Well, we all have things we got to work on. I know I do.
Yeah.
You do, right? You know, right?
Yes.
Okay. He says, limitless power at man's disposal. As marvelous as the concept may be, it's nonetheless true that man has at his disposal, of course, he's writing in a time when he's using the male pronoun, but we can just know that he's talking about men and women, any of us, right? He says, in what he calls his subjective mind, a power that seems to be limitless. This is because he is one with the whole on the subjective side of life. And so this subjective, objective idea, going back again to the time when Holmes was writing this, exciting things were taking place in the world of psychology. You know, Freud's talking about the subconscious mind. Jung's working on his stuff. Henry James at Harvard has written about the subconscious subjective mind. Judge Torr's talking about the subconscious subjective mind. And what do we mean by this? Well, what we mean is that we have really one mind, but it has two parts. The subconscious part of our consciousness is responsible for a whole lot of very important stuff. It makes sure that our heart beats, that our digestiveness takes place, that the natural antibodies get into our system when they need to be, that certain things have to be put into the blood when we gotta run from, you know, things that we need to run from or whatever else, right? All that's handled by the subconscious mind. It takes care of building the body up. But it's also the repository for memories, and it's where feelings live. And the two of those get together sometimes, and they can create some things that are not so good for us. Because we have memories of things in our life experience as we grew up that weren't necessarily positive, you know, and they've planted themselves in our mind, and oftentimes they become fixed beliefs. You're not good enough. You'll never amount to anything. You're only this. Instead of, you are an exceptional young lady. The world waits for you to do whatever it is that you want.
Yes.
But many people grew up without that in their lives, right? So they have beliefs of limitation about themselves, okay? But in the subconscious subjective mind, it stays there. And the thing about the subconscious mind, when we do treatment, that's where treatment basically is going to take place. That's where, when Holmes talks about creating a mold in mind, that's where we're going to create that mold, because that's where the imagination lives also. The imagination is a really neat thing, because what it does is, in our mind's eye, it creates a different reality than the one that we're experiencing. Now, if we're on top of things, that reality is positive for us. If we're not, if we're ignorant of the law and the way it works, sometimes that reality is very negative and can take us into very negative things in life, including diseases and bad situations. Nonetheless, at that point in our mind, in the subjective mind, that's where creation takes place. And why is it that that's where creation takes place? Because at that part of our mind, that's when we're, to use the vernacular, that's where we're hooked up with God. That's where the connectedness is. Do you see, there's one universal subjective mind. It's the mind of God, okay? And we use it, we partake of it. But what we partake of is just our own individualized aspect of the entire thing. We don't have a separate that we walk away with. There's no walls around us. we're connected. It's kind of like in the early days of the computers when they had those cables that connected 50,000 different plugs, and you see them, like, well, that's kind of the way the subjective mind is within us. We're hooked up to the divine at that point. But the other side of this is this thing we call the objective mind, the conscious mind. And the conscious mind is where we go through our day-to-day stuff and we think about things and we do things and stuff. And that's where, back when we were little and people were saying not so positive things about us, our conscious mind took that in, but it deposited that into the subjective side. But that same process can also be changed. We can take positive ideas in the conscious mind and we can plant them in the subconscious, the subjective mind. Just like a gardener plants a seed, okay? Now, if we nurture that seed, that thought, that positive affirmation, by continuously aligning with what it is that we planted, that seed will grow. But if we plant that seed and then we bring worry, fear, and various other, non-aligning thoughts, anger and so on and so forth, it's like weeds in the garden. And it can choke out that seed, it can choke out that growth. So when we come to New Thought, when we come to Science of Mind and we say there's a power and presence for good in the universe that is available to you, that's as real as where you're sitting right now. But you also have to understand that you've got to meet it on its terms. And people think, well, if I do that, then I've got to give up. That's not true. True liberty is found when we align ourselves with principle, because all of our needs, wants, and desires are provided for. And they're provided for in an abundant way, and in a way that no matter what's going on in our life, we are divinely guided and divinely guarded throughout the day. People talk about the law of attraction. That's where it really comes in. The power of now, that's where it comes in. But you've got to be in the present moment. You've got to understand what God is. You've got to understand what your relationship to God is. You can't just know that when you walk into this casino because you want to win the slot, that you put your money in and you pull the thing and it's going to come out, because it doesn't work that way. We all know that we can win at a slot machine if we put enough money in. It may take a lot more than what we're going to get back, but eventually we can win, right? We can do that. Well, who wants to waste their time doing that when there's a much better game in the field, and that game is aligning ourselves with principle and coming to God with our desires. Coming to God with a desire and a knowledge that as we come to God with that desire, that God will answer our prayers at the level of our belief. And you say, okay, well, I'm working on building up my belief, and God's not showing up. Well, God has shown up. Our belief's just got to grow. We have fixed beliefs in that subjective mind. That little quotation that I really like sharing all the time is the things that we say and do are limited by what we fail to notice. And because we fail to notice that we have failed to notice, there's little that we can do to change until we notice how failing to notice has shaped our thoughts and deeds.
Yeah.
Whew, got it out there. But the thing is, what does that mean? What it means is we got a lot of stuff going on between our ears and the subconscious mind that we're not aware of. And yet the things that are there that we're not aware of are shaping our thoughts and deeds throughout the day. Have you ever been going along and all of a sudden something happens, catches you off guard, and the response to whatever it was is so unnaturally not you? That's not me. I don't act that way. Obviously you do, because you did. That's because there's something going on. I've talked about this many times. You want to find out what your beliefs are in your life if you don't know what you believe? Sit down, take out a pencil and paper, and write out the things that are going on in your life that you're not necessarily happy with. And then take those things and see if you can group them into groups of kind of like-minded things. And then, instead of trying to take on the whole thing at once, just pick one group. And then ask yourself, what do I have to believe for this to be true in my life? And if it happens to be that you're behind in your bills, your bank account's empty, there's not enough money at the end of the month, well, it has to do with abundance, doesn't it? What do you have to believe about abundance to be in a position of lack? You have to believe in lack. You have to believe in unworthiness. You have to believe that you're not a valuable being, and you are. You are a creation of God, and God is expressing as you. Bye, Kelly.
Bye.
Have a good meeting.
Thank you.
We'll treat for that. She's got a board meeting to go to. So the thing is that, where we're at in our minds in any moment determines how we are in relation to divine principle. So as a new thought person, as a person that's seeking to experience and express a greater good in their life, then we begin to work on what Holmes calls right thinking. Right thinking is not perfect thinking. It's just trying to think rightly. And when we find those things where we have issues within ourselves, we say, okay, that's all right. First, I got to remember that God is expressing as me and through me. I am a worthy being. I am not less than because I've had less than thoughts in my mind. I've had certain things that I would be ashamed if the public knew about. Forget that. God doesn't care. God doesn't care about your story. God cares about where you're at right now. It's done unto you as you believe. And that is the teaching. You bring your faith to it. You bring your belief to it. And as you do, beliefs change, surprisingly enough. But not only do beliefs change, but we grow in our spiritual understanding. And as we grow in our spiritual understanding, our beliefs grow about what we believe about spirituality. You know, for most of us, we believe that God was the guy up there. You know, we better toe the line because it's going to come. We're going to cross that point once we quit breathing. And boy, we better be good, because if we're not, it's going to be long, hot, and hardy, and we're not going to be so happy. And that's been what most people were taught. But that's not a true teaching. You were talking about Zarathustra. That's where that came from. He's the guy. You see, in the early days of the Hebrew family, when they were overrun by the Assyrians and they were taken back to Mesopotamia, they came, now they didn't take them all. They took the intelligentsia, they took the leadership, you know, the smart ones, right? And they took them back into Mesopotamia. And they came into contact with Zoroastrianism. That's the religion of Zarathustra. And he had a concept, an idea. And the idea was there was one God, and that was Ahura Mazda. But that one God, in order to explain why they were continually being overrun by warring or, you know, horseback tribes that were stealing their women and sheep and so on and so forth, there was an evil one. And the evil one might have been Tiamat. I don't remember now. But anyway, there was this war going on between the two of them, right? Kind of sounds familiar. Well, wait a second. There's going to be an ultimate war, an Armageddon, if you will. But before that comes, there's going to be someone that's going to come that's going to save all true believers. We heard this story before? This is where it came from. And then as the Hebrew people migrated back into Judea, these beliefs came with them. And there's a historical documentation how their personal God of their tribe became the one God. And all of a sudden now then we have this opposing evil person that we call Satan or the devil. And then we have this concept of a Messiah. And all that came out of Mesopotamia. It didn't come out of the Old Testament. It came out of Mesopotamia first, and then it was put in the Old Testament. And so when we understand that, we realize, as Harry Emerson Fosdick told the people back in 1922, that the Bible is not the inerrant word of God, but it is written in context for a time and the people that were there. And there's great things to be learned from the Bible, but don't take it as the absolute law. And he went on to teach what he taught. But Ernest Holmes went on to teach what he taught. And so did the Fillmores and the Brooks sisters and many other people within the New Thought movement. So we're talking about this limitless power at our disposal. Limitless power at our disposal. You know, if I can turn a dime at the end of the week, I'm doing pretty good, right? Maybe I could do more than that. But I got to believe I can do more than that. And if I can believe I can do more than that, and I hold myself in consciousness, I align myself with principle, and I continue to meet with like-minded people like we do here on Sunday to kind of recharge our batteries, right? Then, you know, next week I got a quarter instead of a dime. Now, I could have had $10, but my mind wasn't willing to open up to $10, but it could do a quarter. We will expand at the level of our ability to expand. You know, you cannot walk out of here and say, okay, I'm going to win the lotto today, because you don't believe it. And you can say, yeah, I really do believe it. Consciously you might, but there's a fixed belief within your subconscious mind that says, you know what? That ain't going to happen. It takes 18 million people to buy the one ticket that's going to win. What's the chances of me being that 1/18th million person, right?
Just as good as anybody else.
It is, but anybody else can get it too. And that's the deal. Believing that you're the one and it's not anybody else. That's where we gotta, and you gotta be careful with that because, you know, are you taking yourself out of alignment with principle? Think about
Yeah.
it, okay?
Okay.
So we're moving forward. We got the concept. Limitless principle. God is the thing itself. We have to align ourselves. There's good that can come in our life, and we are the generators of that good in the choices that we make, right? So we go forward and says, all thought is creative. Now this is an interesting thing. As we're working on creating positive thinking for ourselves, positive thought, boy, positive. But as we go through the day, there's that trend of thought. You know, some of it's just the list of stuff I gotta buy at the store. Some of it's the honey-do list. But some of it is some of that stuff that's tied to those beliefs that we have that we're not aware that we have. And we're not necessarily consciously aware that we're thinking those thoughts, but they're going through our mind. And you'll catch yourself sometimes, and all of a sudden you'll realize, you know, you're listening to something. If you have an audiobook, for example, and you're listening to that audiobook, and all of a sudden you find your mind has wandered somewhere else. Well, that's what's going on. It's that same thing. And it happens as you go through the day, only you're not necessarily aware of it. So, how do we change that? First off, we have to understand that we can. We have the power to change it. That's one of the things that New Thought teaches. We have that power, and we can make that change. But we're going to have to put it in our time. Our time is, remember the handout I put up last week? That formula? That formula is a great way to make changes in your life, okay? And that formula goes, for those of you that weren't there, very simply, it is study, meditate, and pray to build faith and belief by constantly challenging yourself to commit to change. And the change that you want to commit to is the change for better in your life. And that's a formula that anybody can apply. It just takes time. Every day, commit to it. If you're not taking time every day to at least align yourself with principle, 5 minutes. Are you worth 5 minutes? Is your life happiness? Is your goodness? Is the abundance in your life worth 5 minutes? And you'll find if you start spending, this is where people, you know, they go, well, I don't know if I want to spend that 5 minutes, because what happens, you spend that 5 minutes and it feels pretty good and you'll want to spend more. Well, I don't have the time to spend more, so I'm not going to give that first 5 minutes up, right? No, give that 5 minutes up. You're worth it. When you look in the mirror, it's not a body of cells and tissue that's looking back at you. It's God looking back at you, expressing as you in this life experience. You are not separate from the divine principle. You're not separate from the thing itself. You are, and you have available to you. And so that's what, you know, as Holmes is introducing people to this concept in the first introductory chapter of The Science of Mind, that's what the thought that he's trying to get across to people. He says, the simplest way to state this proposition is to say that we have a conscious mind that operates within a subjective field which is creative. The conscious mind is spirit, the subjective mind is law. One is the complement of the other, and no real individuality could be expressed without the combination of both. The love of God is the provider, if you will, the creator of God. The law of God is the way, the means that creation becomes a reality in your life. And that we call it the law of cause and effect. First cause is God. Everything else comes from there. And if we're experiencing things in our life that we don't want, we don't like, then we can change it. But we have to put the law we have to put it into practice in our lives. There's things that we may have to do, but we can do that. And if we look out in the world and we see things in the world that we don't like, you know, charging out in the world and telling people how they need to change isn't going to do it.
No.
Changing yourself,
Yes.
it's amazing. Changing yourself will change the world.
That's right.
I didn't bring the book today, and I was going to. In a little booklet that Reverend Ike wrote, addressing this particular topic, he says, you know, when you want to change, you want to see change in your life, and you want to see change in the world around you. He says, seek to change yourself. He says, you're going to find out one of two things happens. Either the world around you changes for the better, or you change in such a way that you can understand the world that's around you. Either way, you win. But you got to do the work, you know. It's not about going, dear God, I want you to do for me, and I'll come back and I'll talk to you next week, you know, or the week after, or whatever. You know, doesn't work that way. He says, learning to trust will make us happy. So all men seek a relationship to the universal mind, the oversoul, or the eternal spirit, which we call God. And life, you know, let's stop right here. I've had people, as I've read this before in the past, said, well, you know, atheists don't believe in God. Well, that may be. But if you ask any atheist what the definition of God is, they can tell you. So on some level, they have an understanding of what God is. Now, they can choose not to believe in what they define as God. However, you'll ask them, do they believe in themselves or self-confidence? They say, yeah. So do you call God self-confidence or the thing itself? Who cares? It doesn't make any difference. There's no individual that we need to convert to our way of believing or thinking. However they relate to the divine principle is perfect for them at this place and this time. But someone that doesn't believe in God will believe in the power of positive thinking, probably. Will believe in aligning themselves with things that they consider to be morally correct and good. They will believe in having self-confidence to grow their life. And this is not much different than when we teach things about prayer treatment. It's just the words have been changed, but not really the understanding. It doesn't make any difference. So learning to trust will make us happy. Whatever it is that we've got that we figure we can put our trust in. He says, intuitively we sense that every person in their native state is some part or manifestation of the eternal principle, and that the entire problem of limitation, evil, suffering, uncertainty is not God ordained, but is the result of ignorance. In all you're getting, the commandment is, get understanding. And understanding, I'm going to talk about intelligence here, because intelligence is one of those things that has multiple definitions. And I looked it up and I forgot to bring it with me, so we'll just have to wing it on this. But first, we're going to start with an old saying, and I believe it's an Eastern saying, meaning as in from like India, right? And it goes, God sleeps in the rock, dreams in the plants, stirs in the animal, and awakens in mankind, or humankind. When we talk about intelligence, we're not talking about IQ here. We're talking about the ability to understand and to make choices. And we talk about degrees of livingness, and we've talked about that before. And that goes back to that little saying I just had. The degree of livingness that humanity has available to them is immense when they realize that they have this degree of livingness available to them. And our purpose here is to live life and to live it more abundantly, which means live it with greater livingness. And we live it with greater livingness when we do more, when we experience more, when we have more, when we can share more with the world, when we can bring happiness into the world, when we can bring abundance into the world, when we can just do what our heart's desire is and know that it's good. And as we do that, that's creating and living at a higher degree of livingness. And that's available to each and every one of us at the level that we know that, the level that we understand it. So the thing itself, we get that, right? That's George that lives down the street. Yeah, I call him, no. We understand the thing itself is the divine principle, is first cause, is spirit, is source, is God. And God is all that is. Okay, there's the thing and what it does, and that's all there is. And we're some part of what it does. And the thing about this is that we have the ability, because we are, on some level, the divine principle expressing as us in our life experience. And it doesn't get any better than that when you understand that it doesn't get any better than that. And so it is.
And so it is.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you. So the deal is, as you go through the week this week, don't forget you gotta be back here so you can get your batteries recharged next week. Most important, primary number one thing, right? But besides that, thank you for what you shared with us today. You know, we take this and we throw it up in the air and God takes what God wants and we put the rest to work, so that we can have something more for you here. And I thank you for that. Thank you for being here. But most importantly, I thank you for making yourself important enough to put these principles into practice in your life, because that's where the change is. That's why I'm here, so to see you learn and grow and change. And if you have any questions, you can ask me, or Reverend Joanna, or you can ask Mickey. If you need treatment for some particular thing, you got something going on in your life and you'd like, to have this magical thing called affirmative prayer done for you because you haven't quite got a grasp of it, please feel free to avail yourself of us. We're here for you. Again, thank you. And as you go through this week, know that the light of God surrounds you. The love of God enfolds you and the power of God protects you. The presence of God watches over you. Wherever you are, God is there. And by gosh, if you don't know that after being with me this long, well, just know that it is. And that means all is well. And so it is. Thank you. We'll see you next week.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Hello, I'm the Reverend Steve Walling. I'm the host of Central Valley Talks, New Thought Talk with Rev Steve that can be found on Central Valley Talk. We also have a YouTube page, and you can find us on the New Thought Talk Facebook page. We've been doing this now for, 6 or 7 years, and we have a bit of an archive of our shows, and you're welcome to come there and kind of peruse through them, and hopefully you'll find something that resonates with you, that if you're a New Thought student or practitioner, that will help you in your spiritual journey. As we do these shows, there is a certain amount of financial cost that's involved with doing this, and so I want to take this moment to give you the opportunity to help support us and support our ministry. You can do that through PayPal. We have a PayPal account there, and all you have to do is go to PayPal and enter our email address, which is madeirasac@gmail.com. I believe it's on the bottom banner there. You don't have to have a PayPal account to make a payment through PayPal. You can do it with a debit or credit card. You just have to scroll down to the bottom of their login icon there, and you'll find a link that you can do that with. We've been supported over the years through many donations and gifts, and I want to thank all the people that have supported us. Look forward to continuing as I'm making this particular notice at the beginning of 2019. I look forward to another year of sharing New Thought teachings, my understandings of what Ernest Holmes and various New Thought pioneers meant as they created their books and their ideas and their philosophies. It's a powerful, powerful spiritual tool. It empowers us as we make our own spiritual journey in life. And again, I want to thank you for being with us, and I want to thank those that have supported us and those that are going to support us. And I'll see you on the show. Thank you again.